I'm Ernst Zundel with another Voice of Freedom program continuing in a series of the Holocaust of the Germans. Reaction to a book, Germany Must Perish, written by a Jew called Theodor Nathan Kaufman, and he advocated the following. This dynamic volume outlines a comprehensive plan for the extinction of the German nation and the total eradication from the earth of all her people. Henry Morgenthau, the American Secretary of the Treasury, a Jew also, advocated the Morgenthau Plan when this thing didn't fly, which advocated the mass sterilization of the Germans. Morgenthau's plan advocated the mere starvation of the Germans. Now that one was adopted by President Roosevelt, and I want to quote to you the results of this American policy out of a book published in America in 1947, written by Ralph Franklin Keeling, and it's called Gruesome Harvest, the Costly Attempt to Exterminate the People of Germany. Page 68, Hal Fust. I spoke to Hal Fust, who was still alive in the early 80s. I wanted him to be a witness in one of my trials. He was too elderly to come, but here is what Hal Fust wrote from Berlin, February 20th, 1946. Germans are dying in masses. Remember, that's peacetime already. War has stopped, the shooting has stopped, the bombs have stopped falling. And here says Hal Fust, Germans are dying in masses. Not so much from starvation alone, as from illness aggravated by acute malnutrition. A United Press dispatch from Hamburg, Germany, on March 22nd, 1946 reads, 33 workmen collapsed from hunger today. The first signs of a starvation were apparent in this area, with hostility rising among the Hamburg working classes, and food riots continued in Hamburg for the fourth straight day. Dorothy Thompson wrote, the children of Europe are starving. 6 years of war, indescribable destruction, and the lunatic policies which have added to the disintegration inherited from the collapse of the Nazi regime have done their work. Germany, and with it Europe, is skidding into the abyss. The facts are at least being revealed through what has amounted to a conspiracy of silence here. This war was fought by the West in the name of Christian civilization, the four freedoms and the dignity of man, against those who were perpetrating crimes against humanity. But policies which must inevitably result in the post-war extermination of tens of thousands of children are also crimes against humanity. Finally, one American woman reporter got it right. This is what irks us Germans, is this hypocrisy, this constant moralizing, not because you have something to moralize about, but you think that moralizing is a substitute for morality. Your immorality in what you did to the Europeans, especially the Germans after victory was won, is so glaring and so disgusting that you thought you could kind of whitewash it by moralizing. Well, it's not going to fly. 50 years later, finally, we are talking back. After giving Herbert Hoover, the former American president, serving as chairman of President Truman's Famine Investigation Commission, a grim report of Germany's food situation on April 13, 1946, General Joseph T. McNary and Lucius Clay, the military governor, said in a formal statement, and I quote, political stability cannot develop under conditions which create political apathy. Political apathy cannot be overcome in a population which must devote its full effort to the daily search for food. Political stability in Germany is closely related to political stability in the rest of Europe. German transport facilities are required to move relief supplies and exports across Europe. German workmen must be used to man available transport facilities. German coal is vital to Europe. German potash, salt, lumber, spare parts, and other products are needed throughout Europe. Coal production in the Ruhr has declined substantially since the recent food cut. Without food, Germany cannot produce coal. Without coal, Germany cannot produce fertilizer, and unless it produces fertilizer, it cannot improve its food supply. You see, everything was interrelated. There was a logical chain. And even these hateful conquerors finally came to the realization that nations are like organic beings. You cannot cut an arm off to spite the face. There are consequences to actions. And this hypocrite, Ike Eisenhower, who was at this time still demolishing German industries, and Lucius D. Clay, the military governor, who was sending factories, vital factories, outside of Germany to the conquering nations, and especially to Russia, robbed the Germans of the chance to at least get back on their feet. Your policies, sure, they were formulated by German haters like Kaufmann, or like Henry Morgenthau, your Jewish Secretary of the Treasury. That does not relieve you of the responsibility as a people. Remember, you are still publishing heavy tomes, this Jew Goldhagen, in which he makes all the Germans responsible for Hitler's policies. So we measure you by the same unreasonable and harsh standard. You Americans, Canadians, Britishers, Australians, New Zealanders, English speakers, are historically, morally responsible for your ill-conceived, stupid, and criminal policies. It was hard, wasn't it? But it is a crime to starve children and the aged and the infirm, especially if you have lied to them with propaganda that you're going to liberate them from some monstrous regime. And then you end up, as we had quoted in a previous program, that the death rate in Germany under your regime, as soon as you took power, was 16 times higher than it was at the height of the war when Hitler was fighting on all fronts in 1943. And when the death rate of children in Vienna under your occupation reached 100%. And when in the rest of Germany, infant mortality has reached a horrifying height of 19%. 90%. You are responsible. You were in charge of Germany. It was your policies. Actions have consequences. Ideas have consequences. Remember, you held the Germans responsible for the last 50 years of the most fanciful tales that you accept so readily as fact without ever examining them. You suspend your critical logic. You believe every survivor from a concentration camp who shakes his bony little arm with his fake number that he most likely got tattooed on for a package of Lucky Strikes so he could get free rides in the subway and extra pensions. You believe all of them. Everything. Well, you're now going to hear out of an American book published in 1947 called Gruesome Harvest by Ralph Franklin Keeling what your policy was really like. And you tell me it was liberation? No. It was subjugation. It was a conquest, pure and simple. Your policies were driven by hate, ethnic hatred, because the people who promulgated the policy were American Jews. And we Germans learned that. Henry Morgenthau and the people in Nuremberg, the interrogators who beat our leaders and the people who judged our leaders and prosecuted our leaders. And remember, your own Chief Justice, Harlan Fiske Stone, said that Jackson was running a high-grade lynching party in Nuremberg. We will remember, because we Germans have a sense of history. We lived through it, and I, as one son of those Germans, am paying witness to my father's generation and to my own starved generation. 50 years after the war, the German people are finally talking back. And I feel privileged that I can do it in your language. And that the United States Constitution, which Germans helped formulate and fight for, gives me a chance to appeal directly over the head of these American media manipulators and at least reach a few million people and maybe finally get a movement going to stop this insanity, to stop this hate-mongering, and to stop robbing the Germans of a dignity and of their heritage. We too are people with feelings. And I'm rubbing your nose into the effects of American policy, not because I like to do it. I'm doing it out of utter desperation, because the anti-German hate campaign is relentless, and somebody has to give you a German reaction, and let me, Ernst Zundel, be that man. I return to this American book, talking about the results of your policy on Europe. The statement by Lucius Clay, who was the military governor, went on to point out that the American zone, even in normal times, had been a deficit area with regard to food, requiring 2 million tons of imports in 1943 and 44. It said that the German economic pump must be primed with food imports because the American zone and other Western areas cannot produce enough to sustain life, even at starvation levels. 10 months after Victory in Europe Day, only 600,000 tons of food had been imported into our, meaning the American military zone of government, or about 1 ounce per person per meal. 1 ounce per person per meal. I would figure that's 1 spoonful. 1 ounce per person per meal. That's what you were able to import. Yet American military officers asked GIs to remind the Germans that they owe America a debt of gratitude for feeding them. Evidence that the German famine is deliberate. Senator Homer E. Capehart of Indiana, in an address before the United States Senate February 5, 1946, said this in part: "The fact can no longer be suppressed, namely the fact that it has been a continuous and continues to be the deliberate policy of a confidential and conspiratorial clique within the policy-making circles of this government to draw and quarter a nation now reduced to abject misery. In this process, this clique, like a pack of hyenas, struggling over the bloody entrails of a corpse and inspired by a sadistic and fanatical hatred, are determined to destroy the German nation and the German people, no matter what the consequences. At Potsdam, the representatives of the United States, the United Kingdom, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics solemnly signed the following Declaration of Principles and Purposes." And then he quotes them. "It is not the intention of the Allies to destroy or enslave the German people." So the senator went on to say, "Mr. President, the cynical and savage repudiation of these solemn declarations, which has resulted in a major catastrophe, cannot be explained in terms of ignorance or incompetence. This repudiation, not only of the Potsdam Declaration, but also of every law of God and man, has been deliberately engineered with such a malevolent cunning and with such diabolical skill that the American people themselves have been caught in an international death trap. For 9 months now, this administration has been carrying on a deliberate policy of mass starvation without any distinction between the innocent and the helpless and the guilty alike. The first issue has been and continues to be purely humanitarian. The vicious clique within this administration that has been responsible for the policies and practices which have made the madhouse of Central Europe has not only betrayed our American principles, but they have betrayed the GIs who have suffered and died, and they continue to betray the American GIs who have to continue their dirty work for them. The second issue is that is involved is the effect this tragedy in Germany has already had on other European countries. Those who have been responsible for this deliberate destruction of the German state and this criminal mass starvation of the German people have been so zealous in their hatred that all other interests and concerns have been subordinated to this one obsession of revenge. In order to accomplish this, it mattered not if the liberated countries in Europe suffered and starved. To this point, this clique of conspirators have addressed themselves. Germany is to be destroyed. What happens to other countries of Europe in the process is of secondary importance. Now, this was Senator Homer E. Capehart from Indiana, speaking in the United States Senate February 5th, 1946. Now, he was a senator in the United States. 1946 was not an opportune time to mention it. Let me mention it. The clique that he talks about, that are American policymakers who have done this mass starvation, are the planners around Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, who were Jews. Why should I, as a German, why should the senator blame American Christians or American people? Goldhagen blames the Germans blanketly. I don't even blame the Jews blanketly, because I know that there were all kinds of decent Jews who had no finger and no hand in that. But there were and are these hate mongers that will not let inter-ethnic harmony reign, because they want to destroy Germany. That was their policy. And now they have dreamt up and concocted this Holocaust baloney and befuddled the American public that has suspended its critical thinking, so that Spielberg, this evil genius, and his cohorts can spread their lies unimpeded. And they try people in courts like myself who basically say, let's toll the bell for freedom, and hold up a mirror to your society and say to you, look, no one nation is all evil, no one nation is all good. Jews don't walk across water, they haven't yet sprouted wings, and Germans don't grow horns. That's the reason why I'm doing this program. I want sanity to return. And I want you Americans to know, especially now that you are your grandfather's generation is dying, like our grandfather's generation is dying, the eyewitness to that. I am one child of that famine, and I survived it. And I want you to know what was done in your country's name, deliberately, by what the senator from Indiana says, a clique, like a pack of hyenas struggling over the bloody entrails of a corpse, and inspired by a sadistic, fanatical hatred that are determined to destroy Germany and the German people, no matter what the consequences. And then I want to quote to you from one of your judges, Wennerstrom, whom I contacted to be a witness in one of my court cases. And he said that in Nuremberg, recently naturalized Americans, meaning Jews, aliens, were the dominant force. So you Americans have got to understand that what you have just been used as suckers. You did the dying, you did the bleeding, you did the freezing, you did the suffering, you did the sweating, you did the work, so that these people, according to your own senator from Indiana, says that it cannot be any longer suppressed, namely the fact that it has been continues to be a deliberate policy of a confidential and conspiratorial clique within the policy-making circles of this government to draw and quarter a nation now reduced to abject misery. It's not me, the German, talking. It's one of your own American senators speaking in the Senate of the United States. You can read it in the reports of the Senate, February 5th, 1946. And then he says that in this clique, in this process, this clique, like a pack of hyenas struggling over the bloody entrails of a corpse and inspired by a sadistic and fanatical hatred, are determined to destroy the German nation and the German people, no matter what the consequences. I can already hear you Americans who have been spoon-fed on the Holocaust crap say, serves the Germans right. Now, how about if it is untrue what these Jews are claiming about the Holocaust? How right does it serve the Germans then? How will it make you look? What is all this revenge taking then? How come that 4,308,000 Jews and Jewish organizations can claim pensions from Germany? Over 100 billion to be correct, of which Germany has settled 99.8%. Now, how long will you people allow yourselves to be suckers? That's my question. And so I want to give you the means by which you can free yourself from this cult of the Holocaust, this clique, as he calls it, of hyenas with their fanatical hatred and their sadism. We Germans have had enough. We want you to help us get our honor back. You robbed us of it, now you help us restore it. It was done in your name. So you bear the responsibility, because this is the standard you applied to the German people. And we are applying sooner or later. Believe me, the wheel of history turns. Nations have their ups and their downs. We will imply and apply the same cruel, ruthless, harsh moral code and judgment over your actions. Let me return to gruesome harvest. These remarks by the American senators were interspersed with a mass of supporting evidence. There can be no question that there has been a deliberate attempt to keep the facts from the American public. Senator Eastland of Mississippi, for example, in a stirring address to the United States Senate December the 3rd, 1945, exposing the chaotic conditions in Germany, told of the great difficulty he had encountered in gaining access to official reports on the conditions in the Reich made by Calvin Q. Hoover. He said that the State Department at first refused to furnish him a copy of the report, but that through the intercession of a high official in the department he had been able to obtain it, but only with the understanding and a promise received from the first that the information therein would not be made available to the people of this country. Does that sound like a conspiracy to you? I think it does. If one of the highest officials of the State Department begs Senator Eastland to say, don't make it public to the American people, well, I am making it public to the American people. I know it's 50 years later. 50 years is long enough. We have allowed these, as this senator says, this group of hyenas in sadistic and fanatical hatred to divide us long enough. It's time to basically throw the rascals out. Let Germans talk to Americans person to person, man to man, without the Jewish intercession. So, Senator Eastland then says, there appears to be a conspiracy of silence to conceal from our American people the true picture of conditions in Europe, to seek to secrete from us the facts regarding conditions of the continent and information as to our policies towards the German people. Are the real facts withheld because our policies are so cruel that the American people would not endorse them? What have we to hide, Mr. President? Why should these facts be withheld from the people of the United States? There cannot possibly be any valid reason for secrecy. Are we following a policy of vindictive hatred, a policy which would not be endorsed by the American people as a whole if they knew the true conditions? Mr. President, I should be less than honest if I did not state frankly that the picture is so much worse, so much more confused than the American people suspect, that I do not know of any source that is capable of producing the complete factual account of the true situation into which our policies have taken the American people. The truth is that the nations of Central, Southern and Eastern Europe are adrift on a flood of anarchy and chaos. Let's see what a Jewish writer, Victor Golansk, Gollanczz, influential left-wing British publisher and pamphleteer, in his book Leaving Them to Their Fate, The Ethics of Starvation, what he wrote after the war about this starvation of the Germans, this plan to basically kill the Germans after the guns had fallen silent by one means or another. He says, the plain fact is, when spring is in the English air, we are starving the German people. And we are starving them not deliberately in the sense we prefer their death to our own inconvenience. Others, including ourselves, are to keep or be given comforts while the Germans lack the bare necessities of existence. If it is a choice between discomfort for another and suffering for the German must suffer. If between suffering for another and the death for the German must die. Victor Golanczz also wrote a book called Out of Darkest Germany, in which he reproduced the photographs of German kids, and I could well have been one of those children, because that's exactly how I looked. So if you want to go to any library, good library, you can get Victor Golancz's books, and they will tell the story the way I'm telling it to you now. Back to page 72 of the book Gruesome Harvest, to continue our story on the Holocaust of the Germans. He describes the ample British diet and stocks of food while the Germans starve, and says, stocks of food and feeding stuffs in this country, owned and controlled by the Minister of Food, exclusive of stocks on farms or held by secondary wholesalers and manufacturers, were estimated to total on the last day of March no less than 4 million tons. He rejects the thesis that we should starve the Germans because they would have starved us had they won, on the ground that those who reason as the Nazis are no better than the Nazis. He could have added that starvation of children of an enemy country is to admit having enemy children. One leading daily thinks Mr. Golanczz fails to plumb the depth of the infamy. On the contrary, the starvation, is the product of foresight. It was deliberately planned at Yalta by Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, and the program in all its brutality was later confirmed by Truman, Attlee, and Stalin. The intent to starve the German people to death is being carried out with a remorselessness unknown in the Western world since the Mongol conquest. I rest my case right there. Ample food stocks nearer to Germany, even than those in England, existed while the Germans starved. On the same page of a newspaper in the autumn of 1945, two articles appeared under the following headlines. 1. West Germans face hard fight against famine. And 2. Come and get it, Denmark tells hungry Europe. The article under the latter reads, the exhausted Danish farming industry succeeded in increasing pigs to nearly 2 million, 60% of the pre-war stock, and last week 45,000 live cattle were offered for slaughtering, of which 32,000 had to be refused as the warehouses are filled to capacity and no shipping was available. Denmark has in vain drawn the attention of Britain to the United States and UNRWA to the facts, at the same time forwarding proposals, but no reply has been received so far. The huge cold storage facilities in North Germany are not being utilized, and refrigerator ships are lying idle in North German harbors. At the same time, slaughtering houses are forced to return live cattle to farmers, the cattle now consuming fodder that otherwise would be available to further increase production as a result of the failure of distribution machinery. Denmark would welcome if public opinion would induce the United Shipping Pool, UNRWA and other concerned agencies to overcome difficulties and supply shipping essential to emptying Europe's bursting larder. An Associated Press dispatch from Copenhagen a month earlier had told the same story. While the rest of Europe hungers for meat, Denmark has 3,000 to 4,000 tons of surplus beef weekly, which cannot be exported for lack of shipping space. Høgsbro Holm, permanent secretary of the Agricultural Council of Denmark, said today that for the last 6 weeks, farmers have had as many as 16,000 head of cattle ready for slaughter, but Denmark has been able to use and export only 10,000. Holmes said, "We have been trying to get transport for at least 2 months, but to date nothing is ready to take the meat." Another report by Robert Conway of the New York News, written March 22, 1946, from Rome, under the headline, "Finds European Shortages Are Exaggeration," reads, "Coincident with the arrival of former President Hoover on his food mission, it is timely and vital that the American public should receive the simple facts regarding the grossly exaggerated talk of shortages in Europe. England is not starving, although food is short. France is better off than England, and Italy is better off than France. The rich and the racketeers are eating sumptuously in London, Paris and Rome, and the poor in Italy have rations equivalent to the diet enjoyed in 1937 at the peak of Mussolini's prosperity era. England is the only one of the 3 countries which is making an honest, serious effort to ration food and clothing and control prices. France is doing better than Italy, but the black market in Paris is flourishing in all lines of goods. Italy is exploiting everything in a fantastic black market based on the contempt of the majority for the nation, of the ignorance of allied, chiefly American officers of language, custom, and the traditional system of bartering and begging. In addition, some officers are flagrantly cooperating in the various rackets. I found it possible to eat well and cheaply in London, Canterbury, and other English towns. I found a similar situation in Paris and its environs. Then I came to Italy, which is a veritable land of plenty, although in all 3 countries, black market restaurants supplied steaks, eggs, fruits, and other delicacies at prices equivalent to those of restaurants in New York. The task of ferreting out the truth of the food and economic situation is a difficult one, and unless a better and more experienced personnel is supplied for the purpose than is evident in the permanent Allied administration here, a distorted and inadequate picture will be given to Mr. Hoover. That the general European famine advertised by Washington is for the most part German, as reported by Senator Butler of Nebraska after a trip through 33 countries, is indicated by the fact that UNRWA has been used to finance governments and not to feed the hungry. UNRWA has in effect supported these governments, mostly satellites of the Soviet Union, by supplying them with billions of dollars worth of goods which they in turn have sold to those with the money to buy, thus bringing in them to themselves handsome revenues in lieu of taxes. In Germany, there is widespread hunger and poverty. UNRWA, this is the United Nations Refugee and Relief Agency, is specifically forbidden to function for the benefit of any but displaced persons, and then only by making requisitions against the starving Germans. In other words, this United Nations Relief Agencies robbed the Germans that were already starving to feed the displaced persons. In August 1946, Cyril Osborne, Member of Parliament, denounced the so-called Relief Agency of the United Nations as, quote, the biggest racket in Europe, end of quote. For another thing, no Central Red Cross has been permitted to function in the stricken Reich, and it is now a matter of history. that the Washington administration for nearly a year hotly resisted all efforts to bring private relief to the Germans and only permitted a miserable dribble when it finally did allow it, and at the urgent request of American military government officials. It placed the limit at 2,000 tons a month, limiting packages to 11 pounds and 72 inches in girth, with shipping charges of 14 cents a pound. Senator Albert W. Hawks of New Jersey had made a strong appeal to the president, urging that private relief packages be permitted to prevent mass starvation of the German people. In his reply, dated December the 21st, 1945, President Truman professed the following. There is as yet, now remember, this is 6 months after the Allied victory, there is as yet no possibility of making deliveries of individual packages in Germany, because the postal system and the communications and transportation system of Germany are in a state of total collapse. He then said, our efforts have been directed particularly toward taking care of those who fought with us rather than against us, Norwegians, Belgians, the Dutch, the Greeks, the Poles, the French. Eventually the enemy countries will be given some attention. While we have no desire to be unduly cruel to the Germany, I cannot feel any great sympathy for those who caused the death of so many human beings by starvation, disease, and outright murder, in addition to all the destruction and death of war. Perhaps eventually a decent government can be established in Germany so that Germany can again take its place in the family of nations. I think that in the meantime no one should be called upon to pay for Germany's misfortune except Germany herself. Until these misfortunes of those whom Germany oppressed and tortured and obliterated, it does not seem right to divert our efforts to Germany itself. I admit there are, of course, many innocent people in Germany who had little to do with the Nazi terror. However, the administrative burden of trying to locate these people and treat them differently from the rest is one which is almost insuperable. Yeah, it just infuriates me when I read stuff like that. The letter makes perfectly clear that we are deliberately discriminating against the Germans, that Mr. Truman expected to be at least a little cruel in his treatment of them, and that he had not the slightest consciousness of the German children as such and the agonies they must suffer, although they surely had little to do with Nazi terror and certainly could be as easily located as Nazis and war criminals. It is not difficult indeed to see how those responsible for our policy can escape condemnation under the following principles laid down by General Eisenhower. While I and my subordinates believe that stern justice should be meted out to war criminals by proper legal procedure, we would never condone inhuman or un-American practices upon the helpless, which is one of the crimes for which those war criminals must now stand trial. The hypocrisy of that man is incredible. When you read his record, when you read his little racket that he ran that was ultimately meant the death of between 1 and 2 million Germans, directly responsible, as detailed in this book, Other Losses, by the Canadian author James Back. English-speaking world wallows in its anti-German hate campaign, blaming the Germans for all the ills of the world, while they themselves went on this murderous, cold-hearted, death by starvation spree as an official policy. Disgusting. Back to page 75 of Gruesome Harvest. Michael Foot, Member of Parliament in England, in discussing this question, reminded the House of Commons that there is an older law than any promulgated at Potsdam for the protection of victims of our policy. But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. It later came out that Russian objection in the Control Council was at least partly responsible for our inability to send private relief packages to Germany. 4 senators, after being rebuffed at the White House in their request that the mails be open to permit relief packages to Germany learned that permission to do so must meet with unanimous consent of all four occupying powers, and that the Soviet Union had opposed the idea. The four gave out this information in a statement which said in part, "The American people should know once and for all that as a result of this government's official policy they are being made the unwilling accomplices in the crime of mass starvation. How long must we expect, Mr. Stalin, to deny your American people the opportunity to express their native humanitarianism and desires?" Russia's inhumane truculence was referred to indirectly by General McNary in a letter to Senator Wiley, February 14, 1946. He explained, "United States citizens have not been permitted to send individual gift supplies to German nationals, as the establishment of international postal service while under study is yet to be effected. Once such agreement has been reached, the distribution of packages within the United States zone can be reasonably well met by the parcel post service which has now been reinstalled within Germany." In other words, the difficulty was a question of agreement rather than lack of facilities. In close harmony with Russia's inhumane attitude, which had an ulterior purpose as part of a larger program, as we shall see, the liberal press has for the most part greeted with silence or derision all efforts to publicize the facts concerning German prostration and to bring relief to the suffering German masses. Eleanor Roosevelt, Senator Connally, and Sidney Hillman, backed by personages in the American military government upon visiting Germany, professed to see no evidence of starvation or suffering beyond what they consider tolerable. The New Republic expressed its horror over the possibility that Senator Wary, who had agitated for a Senate investigation of conditions in Europe, including Germany, might become more influential. In the New Republic's own words, this was his crime. His present efforts are devoted to getting more food for Germany and Austria. In commenting on the New Republic attitude and PM's professed liberalism, William Henry Chamberlain, in his excellent article, "The Crisis of Liberalism," which was entered in the Congressional Record, said, "So it becomes a crime in the eyes of a liberal magazine to try to ward off what is at best acute malnutrition, at worst starvation. As for PM, with its loudly professed code of humanitarian ethics, it gives a daily exhibition in its attitude towards relief for Central Europe of Nazism in reverse, of a positively sadistic desire to inflict maximum suffering on all Germans, irrespective of their responsibility for Nazi crimes." Liberals, in quote, have forever indulged in some relief activities. Here is one case, as reported by correspondent Philip Warden. Washington, D.C., June 6, 1946. The Emergency Food Collection Committee, headed by Henry A. Wallace, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, and Herbert Lehman, has collected $323,000 in cash and is incurring an estimated $300,000 in administrative expenses, Chairman Wallace reported to the Senate Small Business Committee today. Wallace listed among the estimated cash requirements for the 2 months campaign, which is expected to wind up by July 1st, $75,000 in salaries, $45,000 in travel and subsistence claims, $115,000 for publicity, materials and stationery, $28,000 for communications, and $20,000 in state and metropolitan organizational expenses. Well, let me tell you, this is the end of the chapter on the hunger campaign, the genocide by starvation, covered in Gruesome Harvest. Just a note to the uninitiated American reader and listener. I lived during that time in Germany, and it is a bold-faced lie by President Truman in his letter to these congressmen to say that the German postal system wasn't functioning. The German postal system in most areas, maybe in some of the totally bombed out cities, had broken down, but in most areas over rural Germany, the postal system functioned. Parcels could have gotten to those starving people. And let me say, Whose damn responsibility was it then, if it did indeed break down in those big cities? Was it not American and British bombs that destroyed these cities, the civilian areas? War crimes the Allied nations have never punished, never called war crimes except if they were committed by the Germans. Let me tell you, the responsibility for what happened in Europe is totally and absolutely yours and your forefathers. And we Germans will remember. Now you can say, as these hypocrites here indicated in their official correspondence, that the Nazis starved population. Where? Where? Where is the historical record? Where are the documents and the proof that the Germans, when they were occupying Europe, starved people? On the contrary, in previous programs, American government and university officials have said that the Germans ran a very smooth and a very efficient and a very fair occupation regime wherever they went. So don't justify the mass starvation, the mass murder through starvation of millions of Germans after the end of the war by some figment and some propaganda imagination. This is what's the problem with American policy and with American propaganda. Whenever they are on thin ice and whenever they have crimes of their own to cover, they let loose with this avalanche of moralizing, trying to seize the moral high ground. And I say to you once again, as I've said on previous programs, moralizing is no substitute for morality. And the policy of the United States government under Roosevelt and this murderous thug Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, that concocted the plan that was going to turn Germany back into a goat pasture, which even then President Truman, this cold-hearted man that we just quoted his letter from, said that it would have meant the starvation of the German nation, the death by starvation. There is no excuse. And all the Holocaust propaganda notwithstanding, designed undoubtedly to keep the Germans so covered by this artillery barrage of charges and accusations that the Germans would never get their head above the trenches and hurl back some accusations of their own. Well, I'm doing it. I'm telling you. American policy against the Germans after the war was over, when the shooting had stopped already, was murderous in intent, criminal by design. And when they say here that UNRWA was the greatest racket, guess who staffed the main spots in all these American military government offices? And which idiot designed the policy in such a way that you would have to have complete harmony and agreement with the Soviet Union? All these agreements that were signed and written about and kind of concocted by the administration under Roosevelt were made in such a way, undoubtedly, by former emigres from Europe, largely Jews, who went on this, as a previous senator said in the Senate of the United States, this criminal conspiracy that was nothing but intent on hatred and revenge. What kind of a revenge? Because the Germans had finally called and blown the whistle on a system and on a group of parasites. And now the parasite was on top. The Jews who returned to the European theater in American uniforms, be it as prosecutors, torturers, interrogators, lawyers, and so on at Nuremberg, or as administrators in the biggest racket, UNRWA, that the war produced, or for anything else. Basically, the underdog fled from Europe, came back as the top dog, and now was able to mistreat the Germans whom they hated so much. Why did they hate them so much? Because Hitler's government, far from being that evil, monstrous machinery of death that Americans have been told it was by Hollywood, the German government had done the world the service of wrestling down communism, this monstrous evil empire, as President Reagan called it belatedly in 1982 or 83. My father, his generation, fought Marxism and communism really, not with stupid words, but really with a gun in their hand, all the way to the gates of the Kremlin, before you Americans, with your stupid, ill-advised policy, bombed Germany back to the Stone Age and made Stalin the conqueror of half of Europe and allowed this monster and his government to murder tens of millions of people more until finally it collapsed from internal contradictions. So the Germans are not the villain in the piece, believe me. Germany offered and sacrificed her finest generation to make the world safe from communism. And how did you thank it in the capitalist West? You bombed the Germans back in the Stone Age, and after they were defeated, you murdered them in cold blood through a policy of deliberate starvation and economic strangulation. This book by an American author, published in Chicago in 1947, entitled Gruesome Harvest, the costly attempt to exterminate the people of Germany, tells it all. We'll turn to page 78, and we're going to talk about the economic strangulation of the Germans by your policy. It is inconsistent to show solicitude for the welfare of Germany or the German people at the same time to support the Potsdam Agreements, because as we have seen, the latter were intended not to help Germany recover, but rather to prevent her from doing so. Potsdam was based on a Morgenthau Plan, and the Morgenthau Plan had stipulated the following. The sole purpose of the military in control of the German economy shall be to facilitate military operations and military occupation. The Allied military government shall not assume responsibility for such economic problems as price controls, rationing, unemployment, production, reconstruction, distribution, consumption, housing, or transportation, or take any measures designed to maintain or strengthen the German economy, except those which are essential to military operations. The responsibility for sustaining the German economy and people rests with the German people with such facilities as may be available under the circumstances. Now, there was a blueprint for death for the Germans, because you Americans and Britishers and the rest of the Allies had so completely shattered the German infrastructure that there was no facilities that the Germans had. You had grafted your military dictatorship on top of the German body politic, imprisoning millions of Germans in your concentration camps and in your jails. All the leaders that had led Germany for generations were rotting in jails because you had declared whole parties, groups, movements, professions to be criminal. And you camouflaged it as per usual in an avalanche of honeyed words. Moralizing, not morality, moralizing, the great strength of your propaganda, moralizing, to cover up immorality. But we'll get to the bottom of this. Page 78 in the book Gruesome Harvest. Under the circumstances, in this case, must be understood and underscored as meaning an absence of essential facilities. The territorial losses and seizures, the program of overcrowding through expulsion of millions of Eastern Germans, the wholesale enslavement of German manpower, the liquidation of German science and managerial, technical and professional classes through denazification, the setting of the low level of industry decided upon, coupled with the industrial sacking and elimination of all German external resources. All these measures on top of the war devastation cannot be described as anything but a program to throw Germany and her people into a state of collapse. But these are not the only acts of repression. Taxes have been raised to confiscatory levels which stifle incentives and prevent operation of the free enterprise system. They have helped to socialize German economy and kill the profit motive. They have corrupted public morals, for even the poor must contrive to dodge them in order to have enough income to buy shoes. We have refused to establish an exchange value for the German mark in terms of other currencies, preventing privately handled imports and exports, and throwing what little external trade there is into the hands of the military government. And instead of trying to work out some intelligent plan for the resuscitation of the collapsed financial system, we have proceeded to make matters far worse by such actions as the printing of vast sums of occupation currency, which will almost certainly help recreate the 1923 inflation disaster and complete the destruction of the German middle class. Such a result would serve the ends of Soviet Russia, but hardly those of the other powers. I lived during that time. My family lived during that time. This man is absolutely right on the money. German money became worthless because there was a deliberate policy by the Allied occupiers, mainly coming from America, to print money as if it was going out of style, to completely debauch the German currency. Germany lost the war not during the war. Germany lost the war after the war. And there's not a German with half a brain that doesn't understand that thoroughly. So your Potsdam agreements, your Yalta agreements, your Morgenthau plans basically were concocted and written by German haters, by refugees from Germany, and by communists. The United States government under Franklin Roosevelt in the top echelons was so highly infiltrated. All you have to do is read these books that are now coming out, the memoirs. There's one of them that I'm just reading now by Platov, the man in charge in the Soviet Union, a Jew naturally, of atomic spying in America. It makes you shudder in hindsight, 50 years later, of how well America and how deeply America, the top echelons of American government, were penetrated by these Jewish Soviet agents. And America keeps right on sleeping. Amazing to me. Amazing to me. The book is called Special Tasks by a former Soviet general, Platov, who was in charge of the atomic spy operation against the United States. And you know where this guy, Platov, lived today? In California, enjoying the good life. He is one of the, quote, Russian refugees. Man, oh man. You really wonder what's going on. But I digress. Let me come back to what the policy was of the Allied governments against the people of Germany. Economic prostration. This one I want to especially ask Americans of the older generation to listen to, who lived through the Depression, because only you will understand what the Germans went through at the hands of Allied policy, especially American policy planners, after the war. It is difficult to imagine the depth of German depression. When the United States reached the bottom of 1932, industrial production had fallen to 60% of normal. In other words, during the Great Depression, production in America had fallen to 60% of normal. Now, listen to this. The depression was so severe, the losses so enormous, the unemployment so widespread in the United States, that it almost brought revolution, because the production fell to 60%. Industrial production in Germany, 1 year after victory in Europe Day, was 10% of what used to be normal. Come on, America. Did you follow what I just said? When America was in the grips of this horrific depression, these turmoils, soup lines, your industrial production had sunk to only 60%. Yet you and your policies the genocidal policies against Germany out of hatred for them because they had blown the whistle on these parasites who then fled to your shores. The industrial production in Germany a year after victory in Europe Day was 10% of what used to be normal. 10%. So imagine your depression in the 30s, 6 times worse. That's what the Germans were going through in 1945, 46, 47. That's what I lived through as a kid. Production in our zone had gradually risen until it reached a high of about 12% of the old normal, or about 20% of the new permitted levels. With a cut in rations, however, the index began to steadily decline. On May 4th, Brigadier General William D. Draper, American military governor, director of economics, reported that output in our zone was far below that necessary to maintain a minimum standard of living. The report went on to give production figures for individual industries as percentages of capacity. Here are a few examples. Chemicals, the Germans were only able to produce 25% of capacity. Electric power, 20%. Building materials, 20%. Steel products, 13%. Ceramics, 5%. Farm machinery, 22%. Electrical equipment, 15%. Automotive and industrial machinery, 10%. The following summer, it was reported that less than 30% of available industry in our zone was in operation. Let me repeat that. The following summer, it was reported that less than 30% of available industry in our zone was in operation. Deputy Military Governor Clay, at the end of August, declared that it will take at least 4 more years for Germany to recover sufficiently to bring production up to the bare subsistence levels set under the deindustrialization program. Remember, Morgenthau's policy was to turn Germany into a goat pasture, to deindustrialize Germany, and over 550 major industries in the American zone of occupation were being dismantled and shipped partly to Russia, to England and France. All of which would never produce again for the Germans. All of the men who still were alive, and after they came back from prison of war camp, had no work because their factories had been shipped to Russia. Who the hell do you think planned that in Morgenthau's office or in Roosevelt's office? Americans? Don't kid yourself. You know damn well who designed it. War, destruction, plus the Allied program of repression have created thorough disorganization. Of the plants not bombed out completely, many were obsolete. Others located in an area where residential destruction was so complete that there was no room for workers, or where available transportation and communications could serve only a fraction of production. Freight carrying has been slow and unreliable, able to meet only 70% of the low demand. Passenger service is covering only 30% of German requirements. Cars are jammed and passengers even hang on the sides and tops. Railroad shortages lie in rolling stock, shops, manpower, coal, and the result in part from bottlenecks in the inevitable inefficiency of military control. Low coal production has been a key problem, resulting in part from lack of civilian goods available to miners and their families. The American military government official in charge said in July 1946 that the miners must be fed better and treated better in other ways to get improved output. We are going to have to provide decent housing, and we are going to have to make consumer goods available. as an incentive for the miners to dig. At present, they cannot even buy needle and thread with which to patch their pants. There is no slowdown conspiracy, no underground political sabotage by the workers. It is just that they have not enough incentive to work. A high-ranking British officer a few days earlier had admitted that anti-British sentiment is growing in the Ruhr. The Germans, he said, are just beginning to appreciate the economic hardships imposed upon them by Allied policy. It is natural there should be a stiffening of the German attitude towards this policy, and that the British should receive the brunt of this stiffening, since the reparation program takes more from the British zone than from other parts of Germany. As one Berlin reporter put it, last winter there was no coal, and Berliners burned every tree in town and for several miles around. Cold is the most miserable of all living conditions, and as people get closer and closer to the primitive, it is natural that they look to the future. At first I was amazed to see girls walking down Berlin streets in summer clad in long coats of fox or squirrel or sheep. Then I realized, remembering last winter, looking towards another winter without fuel, they've sold the clothing least needed. And I'm not kidding when I say a lot of these Fräuleins are down to their last fur coat. Associated Press bulletin from Herford, Germany, dated September 9, 1946, reads, "The British officially informed the Germans in their zone today they could expect no coal for heating this winter." A little later, an arrangement was made for miners to work Sundays, so that the average family of four in the merged American and British zone could have fuel this winter, equivalent in heating value of a little over half a ton of hard coal for a 6-month period. A month later, the unions voted not to work on Sundays. In the face of this grim prospect, the best that could be hoped for in the way of food by the population living in the very edge of starvation, suffering from famine, edema, swelling of the joints, and all the other terrors of gradual starvation, as stated before, was an increase in rations to the grim and dangerous 1,500 calorie level throughout the 1946-47 winter. In June 1946, Colonel H.B. Hester, in charge of the American military government food branch, predicted a disastrous famine in Germany the next winter unless the ration level was raised by October. His report followed another by Colonel W.L. Wilson, Chief of Public Health and Welfare, that the conditions of the conquered people was sinking rapidly under the present rations. In the French zone, 5,000 have died weekly of starvation. That's where I lived. In the French zone, 5,000 have died weekly of starvation. In midsummer of 1946 in Berlin, 19,000 very serious tuberculosis cases, for whom no beds were available, were reported officially by American authorities. Under Adolf Hitler's government, tuberculosis had been conquered in Germany. Here we have, alone in the city of Berlin, 19,000 very serious tuberculosis cases for whom no beds were available. This was reported officially by American authorities. A medical authority said, many thousands of men, women, and children who, with what reserves in strength and vitality they still possessed, managed to live through the rigors, cold, and hunger of last winter, will not survive this winter, after another year's depletion in their power of resistance to diseases fostered by starvation and semi-starvation. Death's harvest indeed may be appalling. With this frightful prospect, it will behoove relief organizations to operate at maximum capacity if millions of lives are to be saved. Now remember, we are talking about a book that came out in 1947. He's talking about September 9th, 1946, with all these reports that he's quoting. And so, of course, to the writer of this book, this was a very immediate problem. And again, I mentioned to you, I lived through that as a kid. We've talked about the Morgenthau Plan, concocted by an American Jew called Henry Morgenthau, who was Secretary of the Treasury, and which was adopted in Potsdam as American Allied policy. Morgenthau and Roosevelt forced it upon the English in 1944 in a conference in Quebec, and the Morgenthau Plan was in operation well till into the 50s. Some Germans say the Morgenthau Plan is still in operation in a different form. And there are, of course, other plans. There's Kaufmann's plan for the extermination of the German people through sterilization. There's the Houghton Plan, concocted by some American universities in the 1943-44 time slot, which talked about eradication of Germany by bringing in all kinds of colored immigrants and colored troops. In other words, the kind of destruction of the biological mass of the Germans, and so on. But the Big Four officials have laid all the blame for Germany's distress on the war and on zonal separation. In their view, Potsdam would afford the best possible solution to all difficulties if only zonal division could be corrected. German territory west of the Oder-Neiße line was divided into 4 zones to be occupied and administered by the military forces of Russia, Great Britain, the United States, and France. Russia's zone, comprising the eastern half of Prussia, west of the Oder-Neiße river line, is the best balanced of the 4 zones. In addition to containing some 45% of Germany's manufacturing during the war, it produces more than enough food for its own consumption and mines brown coal and other mineral. Other sections of the Reich had been heavily dependent upon it for many key raw materials and manufactures. Stripped as it has been, it nevertheless supplies Russia with a sizable flow of goods, taken as reparations. Britain's zone comprises the western half of Prussia. Within it is the Ruhr district, which contains the continent's most valuable natural resources, especially large deposits of high-grade coal, close to Europe's best iron ores, and lies in the midst of Europe's densest concentration of population in a region served by excellent rail and water transportation. Molotov rightly called it Europe's workshop. Despite intensive cultivation, the zone suffers a heavy food deficit, and even coal production has been at a low ebb since victory in Europe Day. Administration costs are $320 million a year above revenues. The American zone lies in the central and southern section of the Reich. Most of it is mountainous and largely scenic. It is not and cannot become self-sufficient in food production and is highly dependent upon various imports. It perfectly illustrates the essential interdependence of all sections of the German economy. All of its hard coal requirements must be imported from the Ruhr or Saar region, and 83% of the steel required by its many manufacturing establishments must come from the outside. Lack of coal has forced partial or total closing of many industries. For example, the pharmaceutical industry, which needs coal tar, the tire business, which needs buna made from coal, and various fabricating, processing, and finishing establishments. Because of the steel shortage, the largest tin can manufacturer in Bavaria closed, so that some 10 million tins badly needed to put up the 1946 crop of peas, beans, and fruit were not made. Large numbers are unemployed, and administration is costing the American taxpayers $200 million a year. France's zone consists mostly of provincial fragments of former Germany bordering on France and contains no complete political or economic entities. Its chief asset is the Saar Basin, rich in coal and steel. Although intensely cultivated, the zone is not self-sufficient in food because of heavy specialization in vineyards and orchards. It must import its potatoes from Bavaria, for example, and other zones rely upon its food specialties. One of the outstanding facts about Germany is the dependence of each section and now each zone upon all others for food, steel, coal, timber, and other essentials. The peace settlements did not anticipate economic separation of Germany's highly interdependent regions. Since the zones were set up strictly for administrative purposes and were not supposed to exert any decisive influence upon German economy, zonal boundary lines were laid out promiscuously across political and economic subdivisions. The belief the zones would remain one thing and German economy another is clearly shown in the early statements and declarations of policy. Potsdam directs that during the period of occupation, Germany shall be treated as an economic unit. And an earlier Big Four statements on control machinery for Germany decrees that the Control Council, whose decisions shall be unanimous, will ensure appropriate uniformity of action by the commanders-in-chief in their respective zones of occupation, and will reach agreed decisions on the chief questions affecting Germany as a whole. This demand for results, made impossible by the conditions laid down simultaneously, has been about as effective as commanding the sun to stand still. Insisted upon by Russia, the requirements that Control Council decisions shall be unanimous has in practice barred agreed decisions on the chief questions affecting Germany as a whole, and has brought anything but uniformity of zonal action. It has killed Control Council effectiveness, just as the veto power, also insisted upon by Russia, has destroyed the effectiveness of the Security Council of the United Nations organization. France has been particularly obstructive in Control Council voting. Although British and American delegations insisted upon inclusion of France in the for power, control and occupation of the Reich, France has never signed the Potsdam Agreements. In consequence, she is not bound by the agreements, yet is able to veto their execution. She has frankly admitted her opposition to German unification, and for her own presumed self-protection and territorial aggrandizement has demanded that Germany be balkanized and destroyed as a power factor of Europe. To achieve this end, she has obdurately insisted, as mentioned before, that the whole of Western Germany be broken off and either internationalized or added to France. Upon taking her place among the Big Four, she served notice that until these demands were met, she would veto all Control Council decisions, aiming to treat the Reich as an economic unit, and thereafter lived up to her promise, even to such a fine point as rejecting a national postage stamp. France has been by no means alone in blocking unified economic administration. Russia has been almost as obstructive, and would probably have been more so, had France not been so obliging. Even Britain and the United States have not hesitated to balk whenever it appeared selfishly advantageous for them to do so. In the absence of agreed decisions calling for uniform action in all zones, the Reich has become divided into 4 economically deficient and unbalanced airtight compartments, each administered exclusively by its occupying power as though it were a colony or protectorate. More difficult to surmount than those of independent states, zonal boundaries form such barriers to interzonal intercourse that what little trade occurs must be bartered deals arranged by special treaty. Although such economic dismemberment would alone guarantee economic disorganization, it cannot rightly be made to serve as a scapegoat for all the sins of Potsdam, nor for the British and American zonal deficits. Even in the absence of zonal separation, the other harsh and repressive measures ordered at Potsdam would assure German economic paralysis. Disregarding this manifest fact, many officials find it convenient to lay all the blame on the zonal barriers and to argue that if they could be eliminated, Potsdam would be transformed from a dismal failure into dazzling success. The thesis may enable them to avoid admitting the colossal blunder Potsdam really is, but it also serves as a bar for taking steps necessary to meet the trouble fundamentally. Put forward as a general panacea for all German administrative ills, economic Anschluss as many zones as possible has become the chief objective of our zonal authorities. In the attempt to break down French and Russian objections, they offer to divide the Reich into a number of federated states and to guarantee German disarmament for 25 or even 40 years. After this proposal was rejected on the ground that it was wholly inadequate and would lead to war, they offered to merge the American zone economically with 1, 2, or 3 other zones. In making the offer, Allied Military Government Commander-in-Chief General McNary observed, "The United States government proposes this arrangement because of its belief that Germany can no longer be administered in 4 airtight compartments without free economic intercourse, unless paralysis is to result. The United States government is unwilling to permit creeping economic paralysis to grow. If it is possible to attain economic unity between its zone and any other zone in Germany, as a prelude to economic unity for all of Germany." Although Russia and France turned down the offer, Britain accepted, and the task of effecting economic unification of the British and American zones was undertaken. Then the author turns in chapter 8 to teaching the Germans democracy in reverse. Subtitled, "The Lord High Executioners." We thought we were coming to Germany as liberators, to free the German people from dictatorship, to teach them the errors of their ways, and to give them the benefits of our form of democracy and free enterprise. Actually, we accepted at Potsdam a program which negated all of our principles, which could sell our form of democracy only in reverse. The Potsdam Plan was made to order for Soviet Russia, but not for free enterprise or for free democratic processes. Its very execution requires totalitarianism, of the kind the Soviets are accustomed to, of the kind which, when the Nazis were practicing it, so outraged us that we fought a $500 billion war to eradicate it from the earth. We first eliminated the German government, the only instrumentality through which the German people might take collective, self-preservative action, and then substituted the system of military absolutism, born not of free American institutions or ideals, but of the absolutisms dominant at Potsdam. Military absolutism was set up under the following edict. Then he quotes, "In the period when Germany is carrying out the basic requirements of unconditional surrender, supreme authority in Germany will be exercised on instructions from their governments by the British, Soviet, United States, and French commanders-in-chief, each in his own zone of occupation and in matters affecting Germany as a whole. The 4 commanders-in-chief will together constitute the Control Council." You could say that this was the junta, the military junta, banana republic style, that those in this cabal surrounding Roosevelt and Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, with their hatred towards the Germans because they had blown the whistle on their parasitic enterprises in the past, had finally inflicted on the Germans. Nothing about liberation, nothing about democracy. It was a military dictatorship backed up by the bayonets and tanks of the military forces, then occupying a defeated Germany that was bumped back into the Stone Age until they unconditionally surrendered. So let's stop the crap and talk about the liberation of the Germans and the re-educating them into democracies. We'll have a good look at how this policy worked. Set up to function under the heads of this alien military dictatorship is a complicated bureaucracy headed by a hierarchy of descending Caesars, forming a neat replica of the authoritarian apparatus employed by both the Soviets and the Nazis. This dictatorship, as we have seen, had as its purpose not the resuscitation and rehabilitation of the fallen Reich, but rather the repression and the erection of barriers to recovery. With hundreds of thousands of heavily armed occupation troops behind it, the alien dictatorship was also prepared to prevent resistance by the Germans, as they saw the ground prepared for their extermination by their being thrown on their own and forbidden outside assistance, while the necessary means for their survival were destroyed. It has dropped a soundproof iron curtain down around its victims, virtually cutting off intercourse with the outside world, ostensibly to prevent contamination of other nations by Nazi ideas, but also to prevent the anguished cries of the German women and children from reaching and disturbing others while the gruesome program was carried into effect. Remember, emergency is the cloak the tyrant always wears. You tell me how anybody could claim in 1946 and 47 that Nazi ideas were going to spread from Germany to the rest of the world. Germany was in ruins, starving, destroyed. Its leaders were in concentration camps, hanged, tortured, beaten to death, hunted like rabbits. Nazi ideas were going to contaminate the world? Bullshit. That's what that is. So let's go back and find out. As the death news tightened about them, the Germans were to be made to believe they are entirely to blame for their dilemma. So this was the craven way we were to bring self-government to the Germans. We no doubt hoped, for example, that by turning denazification over to so-called German prosecutors and courts, set up and operating under our mandate, we could make the Germans blame themselves for the deleterious effects. We have said it is democratic to make the Germans conduct their own purge, which is tantamount to accepting the Russian purges as democratic. Let me repeat that. We, Americans, have said it is democratic to make the Germans conduct their own purge, which is tantamount to accepting the Russian purges as democratic. But those purges were at least Russian affairs. The German purge machinery is operated by communists and radical Marxist socialists, placed in office by an alien military dictatorship, and no more representative of the Germans than Quisling's Nazi government was of the Norwegians. Our military government is anything but democratic, except in the Russian sense. It is headed by well-trained military men, competent to carry out military tasks, and orders received from Washington and prepared by politicians and behind-the-scenes operators. Instead of a democratic body representative of free Americans, they are order takers. Let me repeat that. Instead of a democratic body representative of free Americans, they are order takers, willing to carry out without question whatever directives they receive from above. Our troops of occupation have been splendid young American boys, but for the most part raw, inexperienced teenage draftees who could be expected neither to relish their job nor to comprehend its exacting nature. The whole experience has tended to corrupt and brutalize them. As mentioned before, our use of disproportionate number of Negro troops has helped alienate the Germans and disgust our own military personnel. In conjunction with the military force, we have sent over a corps of high-salaried civilian employees consisting in large measure of people who have failed in the social and economic competition at home, including in some cases broken down, discharged officers who could not stand the rough going of actual combat in France and Italy, or the chagrin of having to return home as failures before the war was over, but who now draw higher pay than ever in their lives during peacetime before, and who enjoy swelling arrogantly with self-assumed importance before defeated but often more refined, cultured, and substantial people called and caught under their delegated authority. The military men who had the American military government generally believe that the less government interferes with business, the better it is for everybody, except in Germany. And they oppose collectivism philosophically, except in Germany. Although they fought a war to destroy dictatorship, they are willing to serve as one themselves and to impose almost complete control over the lives of individual Germans. Nothing runs without their permission. Zonal rule over the economic, political, and cultural life of the German people, as commanded at Potsdam, could be handled with a modicum of success only by men with long experience in totalitarian philosophy and methodology. And in this respect, the Russian zonal authorities enjoy a great advantage. Whereas the rule with Potsdam orders is alien to our background, our training and philosophy, it conforms perfectly to Russian practices at home. Such rule cannot bring free enterprise to Germany. Only some form of collectivist society could grow up under it. These are points of cardinal importance in the rivalry between Soviet Russia and the Western powers over ultimate control of the German Reich. Again, I come back to you. Who do you think drafted this corset for Germany? If not communists who had infiltrated the American government. It was basically a Soviet plan for the conquest of Germany that America instituted. The fact that it came under the signature of a Jew called Henry Morgenthau and was adopted by a Roosevelt that was already sick, and then was executed by these willing flunkies in Europe and these broken down wrecks and relics that this writer so eloquent describes, failures and so on. No, let me tell you, as a German, you did not bring democracy, you did not bring freedom to Germany. You brought a military dictatorship, conquest, conquerors. That's what Americans, British, and the others were. And we Germans will remember the hypocrisy, for we can distinguish between moralizing and non-existent morality. Your country was so totally changed by that Second World War that you never ever recovered from it. Believe me. And the Negroes that soon rose in the South, unhappy with their condition that you had imposed on them for over 200 years. They did that chiefly because they were allowed to rape German girls and women with immunity. Many of them did. And to loot and to steal and to boot German officers and generals into the derriere. And so, monkey see, monkey do. When they got home to the United States, they wanted to do the same thing in the United States. And so America was changed forever by this idiotic policy of going on a crusade to Europe. Now it's true, the German people lost over 10 million people. 17 million Germans were expelled from their ancestral homelands and forced into crowded Central and Western Germany. Our heritage is besmirched. Our good name as Germans is dirt. You managed to do that in the process. But in the end, it will remain to be seen who will survive the aftermath of your idiotic policy. Here is your policy of re-educating the Germans. In other words, after you bombed the National Socialist government out of existence, toppled the only democratically elected government in existence in Germany, a government you had recognized as the official government of Germany, and once you have bombed it back into the Stone Age and arrested and hanged and murdered its leaders, starved millions to death after, you began to re-educate the German nation. And here is how you did it. Many ardent supporters of Potsdam have become greatly upset about communist plans for taking over the Reich. They have no right to be, because the very first signature affixed to the document is that of Joseph Stalin. The Russians therefore have just as much right as we to lay down the meaning of its loose provisions and undefined terms. When Potsdam calls for the democratization of the Reich, without specifically and exactly saying what it meant by democracy, the Soviets have a perfect right to insist that the order calls for German communization. And this is but one of the pernicious features of this re-education program. Potsdam, in connection with denazification, decrees that ousted Nazis shall be replaced by persons who, by their political and moral qualities, are deemed capable of assisting in developing genuine democratic institutions in Germany. But no hint is given as to what genuine democratic institutions might be. It prohibits propagation of National Socialist ideas without stating what they are, and then provides that German education shall be so controlled as completely to eliminate Nazi and militarist doctrines and to make possible the successful development of democratic ideas. Again, without definition. But forbidding propagation and discussion of one political philosophy and forcing the public to accept a different one held by those in the seats of power is Nazi doctrine. It is also communist doctrine, and the communists claim theirs is the one and only genuine democracy. Political democracy, say the Bolsheviks, is impossible over the long run without economic democracy, by which they mean abolition of private property and ownership, the foundations of free enterprise. But they call free enterprise fascism, and defenders of the American system fascists. And Nazism is a form of fascism. Denazification in Russian eyes, therefore, is tantamount to rooting out our own system, along with all other private property systems. The Bolsheviks call any country or party fascist or Nazi if it takes or advocates measures to curb the activities of communist parties, those which permit the communists to go freely about their business and of destroying them and building a world Soviet Union are denominated democratic. Thus Potsdam qualifies as democratic document. These facts were known, or should have been known, by all the principals at Potsdam. When Russia was permitted to sign the agreements without a clear definition of what was meant by democracy, we were falling into a dangerous trap from which we cannot escape, unless we simply repudiate the agreement we signed. The whole thing makes us look very stupid. Let me repeat that to you. These facts should have been known, or should have been known, by all the principals at Potsdam. When Russia was permitted to sign the agreements without a clear definition of what was meant by democracy, we were falling into a dangerous trap from which we cannot escape unless we simply repudiate the agreements we signed. The whole thing makes us look very stupid. Remember that I have repeatedly throughout this series of programs said it was an ill-advised, stupid, and criminal policy for Roosevelt's administration to do what they did to Germany in the heart of Europe. That's as plain and simple as it can get. It was stupid and criminal. If by democracy we meant our way of life, free enterprise, private property, individual liberties, the protections guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, and government of, by, and for the people, it should have been obvious to us from the beginning that the program to establish democracy by force was foredoomed to failure. We might logically have hoped to wipe out Hitlerism by Hitlerite methods, but we certainly could never hope to establish our way of life that way. Our intolerance of Nazi political opinion, however, justified it may seem, is nevertheless the opposite of democratic in the American sense. Our determination to wipe out ideas by force is a repudiation of democracy's most sacred tenet. People who really believe in freedom of thought and opinion do not use clubs on the debating platform. We despised Hitler for burning books prescribed by the Nazis, not because we were necessarily partial towards the particular books involved, but as a matter of principle. Yet we have ourselves violated that principle and adopted Hitler's by burning all the Nazi books. In words we denounce Hitlerism, in deeds we exonerate it and copy it. The impression has been given by prolonged propaganda that National Socialist tenets were obviously evil and criminal, that they openly called for aggressive war, for example, and conquest of the world. This is not true. There's an American author writing in Chicago in 1946-47 in a book called Gruesome Harvest, the costly attempt to exterminate the German people. Let me repeat what he says. The impression has been given by prolonged propaganda that National Socialist tenets were obviously evil and criminal, that they openly called for aggressive war, for example, and conquest of the world. This is not true. Like the platform of any political party seeking support at the polls, its planks appear to be quite innocuous. In fact, Nazism and its works were praised by many foreign notables, such as Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. When polled, 51% of our own GIs stationed in Germany said they believed Hitler, quote, did the Reich a lot of good before 1939. And 19% of those questioned believed, quote, the Germans had some or a good deal of justification for starting the war, end of quote. It showed a large percentage of the soldiers ready to accept German explanations and willing to absolve the mass of Germans from responsibility for concentration camp atrocities. 29% conceded they had grown more favorable towards their former enemies since they had been in the country. It was perfectly possible for honest, intelligent, conscientious German citizens to be party members and even enthusiasts. For us to assume differently is merely to exhibit our ignorance and gullibility for propaganda. Nazism was wrong in many fundamental respects, and these features should be exposed. The Germans should be shown in principle where these ideas were wrong and dangerous. They should be stated as general principles to be opposed, no matter who advances them, even if they are communists. And the operation should be discussion by free, uncensored debate. Certainly nothing can be gained by treating the subject as undiscussable. The Nazis were wrong in their invasion of the schools and forcing elimination of certain ideas and texts and acceptance of certain others. They were wrong in principle. So are we when we impose our ideas and textbooks on the Germans. We are even more so for being outsiders, whereas the Nazis were at least German. The Nazis were wrong in their strict censorship of the German press, and so are we. We cannot create a free press in Germany through rigid censorship, and we look very foolish when we try it. Persecution of people on account of their blood is deplorable, whether practiced by the Germans or against the Germans. Persecution arises from hate and is stirred by hate mongers. Walter Winchell has said we must hate the Germans. And he quotes, "Let future German generations see them, the German monuments, and find out what kind of blood they were born with," he wrote, a year after Germany surrendered. A new quote, "If they can grow up among the remainders of what it costs to be a monster, the reminders of what it costs to be a monster, maybe they'll work a little harder to get back into the human race," end of quote. Likewise, while Secretary of State Burns was appealing to the Germans at Stuttgart, the Information and Education Department of the U.S. Army in European theater was still calling for hatred towards the German people. In a pamphlet it said, "The feeling of pity for the Germans is very similar to the psychological reaction we get towards a pretty girl who murdered her father in cold blood, owing to the reluctance to condemn one who looks so nice and kind as a murderess." The Germans in their hate-mongering were no more unheedful of the Christian "love thine enemy." The German leaders applied the hideous and indefensible doctrine of collective guilt against the whole people whom they looked upon as deadly enemies. This was one of their greatest crimes. We have committed the same crime by applying the same doctrine against all the people of Germany, including unborn babes. Perhaps the reason we forbid discussion of Nazism, fail to list its features, and try to destroy it by force goes back to our having unconsciously accepted most of its worst features since 1932 without knowing their identity. He's talking about Roosevelt, his New Deal, and his coterie of Jewish advisors and apparatchiks, that whole bunch that invaded official America and Washington. And I would be remiss if I did not point it out to you, because why should I blame the majority of Christian America for something which was not of their doing? I refuse to do it. It would be intellectually dishonest. Now, all of Christian America allowed itself to be sucked into and execute the policy of these circles around Roosevelt and behind Roosevelt, and therefore, as a nation, you have asked the Germans to be collectively responsible for the acts of Hitler and his people. We are now saying to you, same harsh, unrelenting measure. We hold you responsible for the policy of those few behind and around Roosevelt. You don't like it? The German nation hasn't liked for 50 years what was done to it by you. And so, we go blithely on our way trying to stamp out Nazism while practicing it ourselves. The very sampling and stamping is Nazi-like. We came as liberators to teach the Germans how to enjoy self-government political freedom. Yet we have imposed our denazification decrees which so frighten them and that they refuse to take part in politics for fear of the possible consequences under our democratic control. We are trying to teach them democracy, and yet we have so circumscribed what they may teach that their teachers, unless they are communists, are afraid to say anything. Politically, German leaders are not permitted to speak freely, and even those in our military government are afraid to say what they think for fear of consequences. Because of our undemocratic policies regarding freedom of the press, which we preach while violating in practice, the German press is operating in a vacuum. Intellectual hunger in Germany is almost as acute as physical hunger. On top of everything else, our system of justice has become brutalized and highly discriminatory. We have three separate bodies of laws, one for our forces, one for displaced persons, and one for the German population. And in none is there a serious effort to make the punishment fit the crime. For example, a frail widow German mother of 2 small children was sent to jail for 5 months for having in her possession a parachute knife given her as a trophy and remembrance by her husband just before he was shot down over Britain. This is typical, not exceptional. It makes the Germans shudder at democratic justice. While we preach law and order, we coddle and grant special privileges to displaced persons who, according to American military government officers, have been responsible for 50% of the crimes in the American zone alone. While preaching democracy, we have installed ourselves as an alien plutocracy, many of whose members have found black market operations and other shady deals not beneath them. While the Germans around them starve, wear rags, and live in hovels, the American aristocrats live in often unaccustomed ease and luxury. Their wives must be specially marked to protect them from licentious advances. They live in the finest homes from which they drove the Germans. They swagger about in fine liveries and gorge themselves on diets 3 times as great as they allow the Germans, and allow displaced persons diets twice as great. When we tell the Germans their low rations are necessary because food is so short, they naturally either think we are lying to them or regard us as inhuman for taking the lion's share of the short supplies while they and their children starve. We have in many ways shown ourselves quite callous to the sufferings of the conquered. The war left in its wake countless numbers of war victims with disabled bodies, some without arms, legs, eyes, or otherwise disfigured. They and the millions killed in the battle or held as war prisoners have millions of dependents, aged parents, wives, children. In addition, there are the hordes of impoverished, suffering expellees from the East. But the towering needs of all these millions of helpless Germans have been minor considerations to the feeding and housing of displaced persons. Only a little news comes from their loved ones held as war prisoners in England, France, and other Western countries, none from Russia. Nor has the Allied Control Council yet issued a full and detailed list of either war casualties or war prisoners. Thousands are still held in unnecessary, agonizing suspense, wondering whether fathers and brothers who were in the war are still alive or dead. As one German mother said, even a little sympathy would help. I haven't heard from my son for more than a year now. If I knew he were dead, I could get over it. This is the way to teach democracy in reverse. If Germans are ever to become adherents, they must do so voluntarily through conviction, not compulsion. By our behavior, we are making it impossible for them to gain the conviction in the light of what they are having to endure under our control, and because of our policies and weaknesses, they will not easily conclude, as we wish them to, that Hitlerism is uniquely brutal, oppressive, or dishonest. Let me tell you, what you left behind in Europe is a Germany prostrate, is right, confused, brainwashed, robbed of its soul and robbed of its heritage. We will remember. We will remember.